Oh, hey! Didn't see you there. My name is Sam Palmquist, and today we will be discussing psychology's history and approaches. I have Module 1, and that's about the history of psychology. Psychology as a science hasn't been around for very long, but many of psychology's current questions can be traced back thousands of years. These questions include, how does our mind work? How does our body relate to our mind? How much of what we know comes from experience and how much is built in? Philosophers continued thinking about thinking until about 1879 when psychology formally became a science. And this occurred when Wilhelm Wundt and two men were creating an experimental apparatus measuring the lag time between a ball dropping and it hitting a platform, and then those partaking in the experiment hitting a telegraph key. They asked them two different questions. One question was to hit the key when they registered hearing the sound, and the other when the sound occurred. When the sound actually occurred, their lag time was only 1/10 of a second, but when they actually perceived the sound, it was 2/10 of a second. So that was pretty interesting. Psychology then was organized into three branches: structuralism, functionalism, and behaviorism. One of Wundt's students, Edward Bradford Titchener, introduced structuralism, and that is pretty much the early thought that if you use introspection, you can reveal the inside of the human mind. It was unreliable because results varied from person to person, and we don't really know how we feel, like why we feel how we feel, and even though when you recall things, you think you're perceiving it correctly, usually it's actually not correct. So as introspection waned, so too did structuralism. A second branch was functionalism, and this was brought by William James, and it was an early school of thought promoted by him, and it was very much influenced by Darwin. And their thinking was that the reason why we have thinking to begin with was it was an adaptation to help us survive. And this explored how mental and behavior processes enable organisms to adapt, survive, and flourish in real life. But James was also important because he taught Mary Whiton Calkins, because at the time, women were not allowed to be psychologists, and she wasn't accepted into Harvard, so he taught her, and then she scored better than all the men at Harvard, but she still was not able to get a degree in psychology from them. She was the first female psychologist. She was never recognized as it, because that title went to Margaret Flay Washburn, and she wrote The Animal Mind, and although she was very bright, she too was banned from being part with other male psychologists. Starting in the 1920s, psychology really began to shape into what we know it is today, and that was thanks to John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. They really believed in the fact that psychology was the scientific study of observable behavior, and they really introduced the idea of behaviorism, and that was the view that psychology should be an objective science. That's the first part, that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. So we now agree with the first part, but not the second part. Humanistic psychology formed, and that was a very significant formation for the history of psychology, and it was like the perspective that really emphasized the growth potential of a healthy person and how you can be the best person you can be. And they found behaviorism kind of limiting. And the second part of what we now know as psychology came from cognitive neuroscience, and that was the study of brain activity linked with cognition. So now we know psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes, and we got it from these two groups of people during the 60s.
Oh hey, my name is Alex King, and we're going over Module 2, which discovers the psychology's big issues and approaches. So starting off with an overview, psychology is a very big field with 71 member nations starting from Albania and ending to Zimbabwe, showing that a lot of countries are now talking about psychology's big issues and ways to look into people's mind and behavior. So now we go down to psychology's biggest question, and that's a nature-nurture issue. It's been talked about since the philosophers of the oldest time on whether our human traits are present at birth or whether they're developed through experience. And different psychological philosophers took different positions on this issue. Descartes and Plato, for example, said that it was inherited, while Locke and Aristotle argued on the opposite, saying that it comes from experience. Then we found out that they're both right through Darwin's theory of natural selection. He took into account animal structure and behaviors and found that our organisms and nature selects traits that best enable an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. And 150 years later, this is biology's organizing principle. We take a combination of the traits that we're born with and then the traits that we develop through experience in the environment. So now we go to the next section, which is psychology's main levels of analysis. And the definition of the levels of analysis are differing complementary views from biological, psychological, to social cultural for analyzing the phenomenon. So what this is talking about is that psychology has a lot of different fields spanning a lot of issues. That's exactly why we came up with the biopsychosocial approach, which considers the influence of biological, psychological, and social cultural factors in analyzing psychology.
Well, Mr. King, I have a question. If there's all these types of psychology, then do they work together or do they work on their own?
That is a very good question, Al. But the biggest point to remember about everything that I'm talking about is that one of them alone ignores the big picture. All these main types of psychology work together to form the overall psychological approach, which is exactly what we're studying this year. So now let's look to the third and final section of Module 2, which examines psychology's subfields. Now the most important thing to keep in mind, which as I alluded to earlier, which is that all of these main subfields and fields of psychology have a main goal of describing and explaining behavior and the mind underlying it. There is even a branch of psychology devoted to studying the measurement of our abilities, attitudes, and traits, which is psychometrics. So then we go into how psychologists conduct research, and they conduct basic research that builds psychology's knowledge base. So when we look at these big issues, it's important to understand that the basic research is the pure science aimed to increase knowledge. So we have a lot of people that in main subfields that explore this. Signing out, folks.
Welcome back. If the information that the two gentlemen before me have talked about has sparked any interest in you, then there's a possibility that you could be interested in a career in psychology. Contrary to the popular belief of all the jobs in psychology centering around a therapist on a couch, that is incredibly false. The American Psychological Association has said that there are 56 divisions of psychology and the careers that associate with that. They are grouped into 3 different main areas, and the first that we'll talk about is basic research psychology. Some of the jobs included in this area include cognitive psychologists, developmental psychologists, experimental psychologists, educational psychologists, psychometric psychologists, and social. Cognitive psychologists will start us off, and they are the ones that study all the different thought processes and try to work to see how our certain thought processes can lead to certain ideas. The next would be developmental psychologists. Now, these will usually focus on a certain age group and see how we develop and how our development affects different areas of our mind and our behavior. Next would be educational psychologists. These will commonly work in a school setting, and they will work to see how different methods and teaching ways can work to enhance students' learning. Experimental psychologists will commonly be teaching, but also conducting their own research and experiments on the side. Psychometric psychologists study certain methods of psychology and how this can be used to acquire more knowledge to keep progressing what we know about psychology. Social, which studies the different beliefs, feelings, and behaviors affected and how those certain behaviors influences other people. The next main section of psychology careers are applied psychologies. So how this differs from basic is that applied is more hands-on, working more directly with people. Some of these include forensic, health, industrial/organizational, neuropsychologists, rehabilitation, school, and sports psychologists. With forensic, this will include psychology more at a legal stance and how they approach the law and how they approach different crime scenes and how psychologists help explain what is going on. The next would be health, and this looks at how we can use psychology to promote health and to promote certain different ways to prevent disease and to live healthy lifestyles. Industrial and organizational psychologists will work more with companies and workers and see how they can produce more productivity from the workers with certain different methods and alterations in their everyday lifestyle. Next would be neuropsychologists, which investigate the relationship between neurological processes and behaviors. Rehabilitation psychologists will work with people who have lost optimal functioning of their brain and try to bring them back up to speed. School psychologists are involved in the assessment of an intervention for children in the educational setting. You would collaborate with teachers, parents, and administrators, making recommendations to improve learning. Last would be sports psychology, and this will work with athletes to see how they can use psychology to produce the best results for the athletes and to make them perform at the absolute best. This is the third section. These include clinical psychologists, community psychologists, and counseling psychologists. Clinical psychologists will promote psychological health and help treat and research, making sure that, and this is one of the most common types of psychology, working with one-on-one patients, trying to make sure that they have a healthy mind. Next would be community psychologists, which is promoting health in one community or an environment, working to promote it as a whole instead of more of an individual. And the third would be counseling psychologists, which is very similar to clinical psychologists, but this focuses more on treating and adjusting specific problems within the individual.
Thanks for watching. Until next time.